It all began on a night like any other. The protagonist, an art enthusiast with a penchant for the macabre, was scrolling through the darker corners of Reddit, a place where the strange and the sinister often lurked just beneath the surface. It was here, in a dimly lit room, illuminated only by the pale glow of the computer screen, that he stumbled upon a post that would change his life forever. The post was buried deep within a thread titled, "Cursed Objects You Should Never Own." Most of the entries were typical: haunted dolls, cursed jewelry, the usual fare for such a forum. But one post caught his eye, not because of its content, but because of the eerie, almost desperate tone in which it was written. The title read, "The Portrait That Should Never Be Seen." Intrigued, the protagonist clicked on the post. What he found was a chilling account from an anonymous user who claimed to have encountered a portrait that defied all logic and reason. The user described how they had purchased the painting at an antique fair, drawn to its dark beauty. The portrait depicted a shadowy figure, barely discernible, with eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. The user detailed how, after bringing the portrait home, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered, doors creaked open on their own, and they could swear they heard whispers in the dead of night. As the protagonist read on, the story took a darker turn. The anonymous poster claimed that the figure in the portrait began to move. At first it was subtle, a slight shift in posture, a change in the angle of the head. But soon the movements became more pronounced. The figure's eyes, once mere paint on canvas, seemed to glisten with a malevolent life of their own. The user described how they tried to destroy the painting, but no matter what they did, it would reappear, unharmed, back in its original spot on the wall. The post ended abruptly with the user warning anyone who might find the portrait to leave it be, to never look into its eyes, and above all, to never take it home. The final words sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. "It's watching. Always watching. I can't escape. Please, if you find it, don't make the same mistake I did." Despite the dread that began to settle in the pit of his stomach, the protagonist found himself captivated. He was a skeptic at heart, someone who didn't believe in the supernatural. But something about this post felt different. It wasn't just the story itself, but the way it was told. The fear and desperation that seemed to seep through the screen, as if the writer was reaching out from the other side, begging for help. Compelled by a mix of curiosity and disbelief, the protagonist decided to investigate further. He scoured the comments, looking for more information, but there was nothing. The user had vanished, leaving no trace beyond the terrifying account. Undeterred, he began to search for any mention of a similar portrait online. But all he found were dead ends and vague references, as if the painting was a ghost, slipping through the cracks of reality. The more he searched, the more obsessed he became. Night after night, he returned to the forum, hoping to find some clue, some piece of evidence that would either confirm or debunk the story. But each time he was met with silence, the post standing as a solitary monument to a horror that may or may not have been real. Days turned into weeks, and the protagonist's obsession grew. He began to dream about the portrait, vivid, unsettling dreams where the shadowy figure would emerge from the canvas, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. He would wake in a cold sweat, the feeling of being watched lingering long after the dream had ended. Despite the growing sense of unease, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see the portrait for himself. He rationalized it as a challenge, a way to prove that the supernatural was nothing more than a collection of stories told to scare the gullible. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, and with each passing day, it grew, nourished by the fear and fascination that had taken root in his mind. Finally, unable to resist any longer, he made a decision. He would find the portrait, buy it if he could, and bring it home. It would be the ultimate test of his skepticism, a confrontation with the unknown. But as he sat at his computer that night, staring at the now familiar post, a thought occurred to him, one that sent a chill down his spine. What if the portrait was more than just a story? What if, in his quest for truth, he was about to unleash something far more sinister? The protagonist dismissed the thought as mere paranoia, but as he closed his laptop and prepared for bed, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. He glanced around the room, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the portrait standing in the corner, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the silent, empty room. With a sigh, he turned off the light and climbed into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. As he lay there in the darkness, the words from the post echoed in his mind, a sinister refrain that seemed to pulse with the beating of his heart. It's watching, always watching. And as he drifted off into a fitful sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, somewhere, the portrait was watching him, too. As the protagonist delved deeper into the mystery of the cursed portrait, he realized that certain details in the original Reddit post were deliberately vague, as if the author had been too afraid to reveal the full truth. The thought nagged at him, feeding his growing obsession with uncovering the secrets behind the painting. Determined to get to the bottom of the story, he began retracing the steps laid out in the post, from the antique fair where the portrait was supposedly purchased to the unsettling Avant Lawn. But as he did so, a chilling thought occurred to him. What if the anonymity of the post was more than just a precaution? What if revealing the true names and details of those involved could somehow invoke the curse itself, bringing the malevolent spirit closer to him? The idea sent a shiver down his spine, and he knew he had to tread carefully. To protect himself, and to add an extra layer of mystery, the protagonist decided to change the names of the characters mentioned in the original post. He rationalized this decision as a way to maintain the anonymity of the people involved. But deep down, he knew it was also to shield himself from whatever dark force was tied to the painting. He was playing with fire, and he could feel the heat growing stronger with each new revelation. The first name he altered was that of the original poster, who had identified themselves only as Jay. The protagonist decided to call them Sam, a name that felt nondescript yet somehow fitting for the enigmatic figure who had first encountered the cursed portrait. As he typed the name into his notes, a strange sense of unease washed over him, as if he had somehow altered the course of the investigation by changing even this small detail. Next, he changed the name of the antique dealer from whom the portrait was purchased. The Reddit post had referred to him as Mr. A shadowy figure who operated out of a dingy, cluttered shop on the outskirts of town. The protagonist chose to rename him Mr. Black, a name that felt more fitting for the dealer's sinister aura. As he wrote the name down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow crossed a line, that by renaming the dealer, he was summoning something dark and unseen closer to him. Finally, he changed the name of the town where the antique fair had taken place. The post had mentioned a small, forgotten town called Ravenswood, a place with a history of strange occurrences and whispered legends. The protagonist chose to call it Blackwater, a name that seemed to seep with an ancient, foreboding darkness. As he typed the name into his computer, he felt a cold draft sweep through the room, causing the hair on the back of his neck to stand on end. With the names changed, the protagonist began to notice subtle differences in his investigation. It was as if the act of altering these identities had shifted something in the atmosphere, something intangible yet undeniably present. The shadows in his room seemed to grow longer, the air thicker with an almost oppressive weight. His dreams, once merely unsettling, had become nightmarish, filled with images of dark waters and shadowy figures whose faces he could never quite see. One night as he was poring over his notes, he received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line was blank, but when he opened the message, he found a single sentence. "You shouldn't have changed the names." His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the words, the letters seeming to pulse on the screen like a heartbeat. He quickly deleted the email, but the sense of dread it left behind lingered long into the night. The next day, he received a package at his door. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. Inside, he found a small yellowed envelope with his name scrawled across it. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a single photograph. A grainy, black and white image of the portrait. The figure in the painting was just as he had imagined. A shadowy silhouette with piercing, lifelike eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. But there was something else in the photograph. Something that hadn't been in the Reddit post. In the background, barely visible, was a reflection in a dusty mirror. A man standing just out of frame, watching the painting with an expression of sheer terror. The man's face was familiar, and as the protagonist looked closer, he felt his blood run cold. It was the face of Sam, the name he had chosen to give the original poster. But how could that be? Sam was supposed to be a fictional name, a protective alias. Yet here he was, staring back at the protagonist from within the confines of the photograph, as if the simple act of changing his name had somehow drawn him into the narrative, made him real. Panic set in as the protagonist realized the implications of what he had done. By altering the names, he had somehow connected himself to the curse, weaving his own identity into the dark tapestry of the portrait's history. The lines between fiction and reality were blurring, and he could feel the darkness closing in on him, suffocating him with its oppressive presence. Desperately, he tried to undo the changes, scribbling the original names back into his notes, but it was too late. The act of naming had already taken hold, binding him to the fate of those who had come before. The portrait, once just an object of curiosity, had become something far more sinister, a gateway, a curse that was now his to bear. As the days passed, the protagonist found himself haunted by more than just dreams. The figure in the portrait seemed to grow clearer in his mind, its eyes following him wherever he went. He began to hear whispers, soft at first but growing louder with each passing day, until they became an almost constant presence, echoing in the corners of his mind. And always, in the background, was the same chilling refrain: "You shouldn't have changed the names." The protagonist knew that he had unleashed something dark and dangerous, something that would not rest until it had claimed him. The names, once a means of protection, had become a curse of their own, binding him to the dark fate of those who had crossed paths with the cursed portrait. And as he sat alone in his darkened room, the shadows growing ever longer around him, he knew that there was no escape. The story had taken on a life of its own, and he was now a part of it. Trapped in the web of terror and mystery he had so recklessly spun, the protagonist's obsession with the cursed portrait deepened as he followed the trail of clues left in the original Reddit post. Every detail seemed to pull him further into a web of darkness that was impossible to escape. The first piece of the puzzle led him to a small, isolated town, the kind of place that time forgot. The town, which he had renamed Blackwater, was home to an annual antique fair, a gathering shrouded in secrecy, where vendors traded in objects with murky histories and darker reputations. The protagonist's journey to Blackwater was filled with a sense of foreboding. The closer he got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The town itself seemed to be suffocating under a thick blanket of mist, the streets eerily silent as he arrived. The fair, held in a dilapidated, crumbling building at the edge of town, was just as described in the Reddit post. Dimly lit, with narrow aisles crowded with strange, forgotten relics. As he wandered through the fair, searching for the portrait, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Eyes seemed to follow him from the shadows, and every creak of the floorboards echoed with a sinister undertone. He asked several vendors about the portrait, describing it in detail, but most simply shook their heads, avoiding his gaze as if they were afraid to speak of it. It wasn't until he approached an old man with a stall at the very back of the building that he got a response. The man, who the protagonist had renamed Mr. Black, was hunched over a small table, his eyes obscured by the brim of a worn hat. When the protagonist mentioned the portrait, Mr. Black's hand trembled, causing a small tarnished bell on his table to jingle softly. Without looking up, Mr. Black muttered, "You don't want that painting, son. It's best left forgotten." But the protagonist pressed on, insisting that he needed to see it for himself. With a heavy sigh, Mr. Black reached under the table and pulled out a dusty, weathered box. "I won't sell it to you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But if you're foolish enough to take it, I won't stop you." The protagonist hesitated for a moment, the weight of Mr. Black's words sinking in, but his curiosity won out. He took the box and left the fair, unaware that he was carrying the very object that had haunted his dreams. When he returned home, the atmosphere in his apartment had changed. It was as if the darkness from Blackwater had followed him, seeping into the walls and the very air he breathed. The box sat on his desk, untouched, as he debated whether or not to open it. But his obsession was too strong. He had to see the portrait with his own eyes. Inside the box, wrapped in layers of brittle yellowed paper, was the portrait. It was even more unsettling than he had imagined. The shadowy figure in the painting was barely visible, obscured by a dark haze, but its eyes were disturbingly lifelike, glistening with a cold, malevolent intelligence. As the protagonist stared into those eyes, a shiver ran down his spine, and he quickly covered the portrait back up, unable to shake the feeling that he had just awakened something that should have remained buried. That night, the strange events began. It started with small, almost imperceptible things: a flickering light, a sudden drop in temperature, a faint whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, the protagonist tried to dismiss them as his imagination, but the occurrences became more frequent, more intense. His computer, which he had left off, suddenly powered on by itself, the screen flickering with static before displaying a series of cryptic messages. The messages were brief, fragmented, but they all seemed to be warnings. "Leave it alone. It's watching. You're not safe." The protagonist's heart raced as he read them, but before he could respond, the screen went black. He tried to reboot the computer, but it was unresponsive, as if the very device had been drained of life. The next day, his phone began to malfunction. It buzzed constantly with notifications from unknown numbers. But when he opened the messages, they were just strings of random characters and symbols, interspersed with chilling phrases like, "You're next," and "It's coming." He tried to block the numbers, but new ones would appear as soon as he did, as if the messages were coming from somewhere beyond the physical world. Determined to uncover the truth, the protagonist began searching online for any information he could find about the portrait and the mysterious town of Blackwater. But his searches were constantly interrupted. His internet connection would drop at the most crucial moments, and when he tried to reload the pages, they would be replaced with images of the portrait, the shadowy figure's eyes now seeming to glow with a sinister light. As he continued his investigation, the line between the virtual world and reality began to blur. He would see flashes of the portrait out of the corner of his eye, only for it to disappear when he turned to look. Shadows moved of their own accord in his apartment, and the whispers that had once been faint now filled his ears, making it impossible to concentrate. Every night he was plagued by vivid nightmares in which the figure in the painting would emerge, its cold hands reaching out to drag him into the darkness. The final straw came when the protagonist noticed something strange in one of the photos he had taken at the antique fair. In the background, barely visible, was a reflection in a broken mirror, a figure standing just out of frame, watching him with eyes that gleamed like those in the portrait. It was the same figure, the same eyes, now appearing in his own photos as if it had crossed over from the painting into his reality. Panicked, the protagonist tried to delete the photos, but they kept reappearing on his computer, each time more distorted, more terrifying. The figure grew clearer with each iteration, its features sharpening into something grotesque and inhuman. The final image was the worst. It showed the figure standing directly behind him, its hand resting on his shoulder, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. In a frenzy, the protagonist smashed his computer screen, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The curse was no longer confined to the portrait. It had spread, infecting his life, his very soul. The online mystery that had once fascinated him had become a waking nightmare, and there was no escaping it. As he sat in the darkness of his apartment, surrounded by the shadows that now seemed to move of their own accord, the protagonist realized the full horror of what he had done. He had let the darkness in, and now it was consuming him, piece by piece. The online clues that had once seemed so intriguing were now the threads of a noose tightening around his neck, and in the center of it all, always watching, always waiting, was the cursed portrait, its eyes gleaming with the promise of more terror to come. The protagonist knew that he was trapped, ensnared by the very mystery he had sought to unravel. And as the whispers grew louder, as the shadows closed in, he understood that there was no way out. The cursed portrait had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. And now, it was only a matter of time before it dragged him into the darkness forever. The first night, after bringing the cursed portrait home, the protagonist tried to go about his usual routine, but an uneasy feeling had taken root deep within him. The portrait, now hung on the wall of his living room, seemed to dominate the entire space. Its shadowy figure and piercing eyes drawing his gaze again and again, as if compelling him to look. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on mundane tasks, but the atmosphere in his apartment had changed. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible tension, and the once familiar space now felt foreign, as though something unseen lurked just beyond the edges of perception. As the night wore on, the unsettling sensations only intensified. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, the chill sinking into his bones, and he could hear the faintest of sounds, like distant whispers, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The protagonist rationalized these experiences, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the result of an overactive imagination fueled by the eerie story of the portrait. But deep down, he knew something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained away by mere logic. Unable to sleep, the protagonist stayed up late, sitting in his dimly lit living room, the glow of a single lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but every time he glanced up, his eyes were drawn back to the portrait. The figure within seemed to shift ever so slightly, a trick of the light, he told himself. But the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. It was as though the eyes in the painting were no longer just a depiction. They were alive, conscious, observing him with a predatory intensity that made his skin crawl. Just as he began to consider covering the portrait or even removing it from the wall altogether, a strange noise broke the silence. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustle of fabric or the brush of a hand against wood. The protagonist froze, his breath caught in his throat, and listened intently. The noise came again, this time closer, and he realized with a start that it was coming from the direction of the portrait. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned to face the painting. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper and more oppressive, as he stared at the figure within the frame. The shadowy form had shifted. It was now slightly turned, as if it had moved to face him directly. The eyes, once just painted details, now glimmered with a faint, eerie light, and the protagonist felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. It was as if the figure was trying to communicate with him, to reach out from within the confines of the canvas. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and the protagonist could almost make out words, though they were in a language he couldn't understand. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with a palpable sense of menace. His pulse raced, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he watched, unable to tear his eyes away from the portrait. Suddenly, the lamp flickered, casting the room into near darkness for a split second before the light returned. But, in that brief moment of darkness, the protagonist saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure in the portrait had moved again. This time, its face was turned fully toward him, and its hand, once resting at its side, was now pressed against the inside of the glass, as if trying to break free. The eyes, now unmistakably alive, bore into his own, filled with a malevolent intelligence and a hunger that defied comprehension. The protagonist's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in his haste to put distance between himself and the painting. The whispers had grown into a cacophony, filling the room with a chaotic, dissonant chorus that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The shadows danced wildly, twisting into grotesque shapes that flickered at the edges of his vision, and he could feel the oppressive weight of the figure's gaze bearing down on him, suffocating him with its sheer presence. Desperate, he tore his eyes away from the portrait and ran to the light switch, flicking it on in a frantic attempt to dispel the darkness that now felt alive, crawling across the floor toward him. The overhead lights flooded the room with a harsh, blinding glare, and, for a moment, the whispers stopped, the shadows retreating back to their corners. But the sense of being watched remained, a constant, gnawing presence that he could no longer ignore. He forced himself to look at the portrait once more, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure had returned to its original position, its hand no longer pressed against the glass, its gaze seemingly directed off into the distance once more. But the faint glow in its eyes remained a subtle but undeniable sign that something within the painting had awakened, something that was now aware of him. Terrified, the protagonist backed out of the room, unable to turn his back on the portrait for fear of what it might do if he looked away. The whispers had subsided, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling, filled with the weight of anticipation, as if the painting was waiting, biding its time. He shut the door behind him, but the sense of dread lingered, permeating the very air, as though the portrait's malevolent presence had seeped into the walls, into the fabric of his reality. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time the protagonist closed his eyes, he saw the figure's hand pressing against the glass, its eyes gleaming with that unholy light. He lay awake, listening to the silence, which was now punctuated by faint creaks and groans that seemed to come from the very structure of the building. The whispers, though quieted, still echoed in his mind, an ever-present reminder of the terror that now inhabited his home. As dawn broke, the protagonist knew that he had crossed a line, that by bringing the portrait into his life, he had invited something dark and incomprehensible into his world. The first supernatural encounter had shaken him to his core, and he could no longer deny the reality of what he was facing. The cursed portrait was not just an object of curiosity, it was a gateway to something far more sinister, something that had now set its sights on him. And as the sun's first light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room, the protagonist made a chilling realization. The figure in the portrait was not merely a painted image, it was alive, and it was coming for him. The days following the first supernatural encounter were a waking nightmare for the protagonist. The sense of dread that had initially been a quiet whisper in the back of his mind now screamed with every passing moment, turning his once comfortable home into a labyrinth of fear. The cursed portrait, which had once merely hung on his wall, now seemed to exert a malevolent influence over every aspect of his life, as if it were alive and feeding off his terror. It began subtly enough, small, almost inconsequential disturbances that he tried to dismiss as coincidences. The lights in his apartment would flicker at odd intervals, plunging rooms into darkness before snapping back to life. The temperature would drop without warning, the air becoming so cold that his breath would mist in the dim light. Objects in his home would shift ever so slightly when he wasn't looking. A book on the table moved an inch to the left. A picture frame tilted at a crooked angle, as if an unseen hand had brushed past them. But as these occurrences grew more frequent, the protagonist realized that something far more sinister was at play. The shadows in his apartment, once merely extensions of the furniture and walls, began to move of their own accord. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker out of the corner of his eye, a momentary distortion in the light. But soon, the shadows became bolder, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways, as though they were trying to break free from the surfaces that confined them. At night, they would crawl across the walls, creeping closer to where the protagonist lay in bed, their dark tendrils reaching out as if to touch him. The whispers, too, had returned, but they were no longer confined to the edges of his perception. They now filled the air around him, an incessant murmur that followed him from room to room, never allowing him a moment's peace. He could hear them even in the silence, a constant, dissonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. At times he could make out fragmented words, his name, a warning, a threat, but they were always just beyond comprehension, maddeningly elusive. As the days wore on, the protagonist began to feel as though he were being watched, not just by the eyes in the portrait, but by something else, something unseen. He would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, a flash of dark fabric, a shadow that didn't belong. Once, while washing his face in the bathroom, he looked up to find the reflection in the mirror wasn't his own. It was him, yes, but distorted, twisted, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt and shadowed, as if he were looking at a version of himself that had been drained of life. The sense of being hunted grew stronger with each passing day. It was as if the portrait's presence had awakened something in his apartment, something malevolent and hungry. His sleep became fitful, plagued by nightmares in which the shadowy figure from the portrait would emerge from the canvas, its cold hands reaching for him, pulling him into a void of darkness. He would wake in a cold sweat, the sound of his own screams echoing in the silent room. But the worst was yet to come. One night, as he was lying in bed, too terrified to close his eyes, he heard a sound that froze the blood in his veins. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. The sound was coming from the living room, from the direction of the portrait. His heart pounded in his chest as he lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get out. Summoning all the courage he could muster, the protagonist forced himself to get out of bed. His legs felt like lead as he crept down the hallway, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. The apartment was eerily silent now, save for the steady beat of the tapping, which seemed to echo off the walls, growing louder with each step he took. When he reached the living room, he saw that the portrait was no longer just hanging on the wall. It was moving. The shadowy figure within had come to life, its hand pressed against the inside of the glass, the fingers tapping methodically, almost impatiently, as if it were trying to break free. The figure's eyes, now fully illuminated with that eerie, otherworldly glow, locked onto his, and the protagonist felt a wave of terror so intense that he could barely breathe. But it wasn't just the figure that was moving. The entire room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows writhing and contorting, the air thick with the stench of decay. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room, surrounding him, closing in. He could hear them clearly now, and they were all saying the same thing. "It's too late. You can't escape." Panic set in as the protagonist realized that whatever had been contained within the portrait was no longer bound by its frame. It was spilling out into the room, into his life, poisoning everything it touched. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if the figure were hammering against the glass, desperate to break through. The whispers turned into screams, a deafening roar of voices that clawed at his sanity, tearing at the edges of his mind. In a frenzy, the protagonist grabbed a blanket from the couch and threw it over the portrait, hoping to block out the sight of the figure, to stop the incessant tapping. But it was no use. The sounds continued, the whispers now mingled with laughter, cruel, mocking laughter that seemed to come from just behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there, only the shifting shadows that now danced in the periphery of his vision, taunting him. The realization hit him like a blow. The portrait had unleashed something that could not be contained, something that was now free to roam his apartment, to torment him at will. The entity within the painting had crossed over into his reality, and it was using the shadows, the whispers, and the very walls of his home to drive him to the brink of madness. In a desperate attempt to escape, the protagonist fled from the living room, slamming the door shut behind him. But the sense of dread followed him, lingering like a dark cloud over his every move. The tapping and whispers became a constant background noise, even in the light of day, reminding him that the horror was never far away. As the days stretched into weeks, the protagonist's life unraveled. He became a prisoner in his own home, too terrified to leave the apartment for fear of what might happen if he did. The entity that had once been confined to the portrait now seemed to haunt his every waking moment, a relentless presence that eroded his sanity with each passing day. The shadows grew darker, the whispers more insistent, and the figure in the portrait more vivid, more real, as if it were slowly taking on substance, preparing to step out of the painting and into his world. And as the protagonist lay awake at night, the darkness pressing in from all sides, he knew that it was only a matter of time before the entity made its final move. The horror that had once been confined to a simple painting was now a part of him, a parasite that fed on his fear, growing stronger with each pulse of terror that coursed through his veins. The nightmare was no longer just a story on Reddit, no longer just a cursed object. It was his reality, and there was no waking up from it. The escalation of horror had reached its peak, and the protagonist was left with the chilling realization that there was no escape. The cursed portrait had claimed him, and now it was only a matter of time before it consumed him entirely, dragging him into the darkness that had been waiting for him all along. The protagonist's life had become a descent into madness. The cursed portrait, once just an eerie relic from a forgotten time, had taken on a life of its own, dragging him into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The whispers, the shadows, the incessant tapping, they were all building toward something, a revelation that hovered just beyond his reach, taunting him with its proximity. Desperate for answers, the protagonist threw himself into researching the portrait's origins. He scoured every source he could find: old books on occult practices, online forums dedicated to cursed objects, and even local legends that spoke of strange occurrences in the town of Blackwater, where the portrait had been purchased. The deeper he dug, the more fragmented and contradictory the information became, as if the truth itself was elusive, buried under layers of misdirection and half-remembered tales. But amidst the confusion, one name kept appearing: Lucien Arnaud, a little-known painter from the 19th century whose works were said to be infused with dark magic. The stories surrounding Arnaud were shrouded in mystery. Some claimed he was a brilliant artist who had made a pact with a demon to achieve fame and fortune. Others said he was a madman who had descended into the occult, using his paintings as vessels to trap the souls of his enemies. But all the stories agreed on one thing: Lucien Arnaud's paintings were cursed, and anyone who owned one was doomed to a fate worse than death. The protagonist's search led him to a rare book, an out-of-print tome on the occult that mentioned Arnaud by name. The book was filled with gruesome details, rituals involving blood sacrifices, incantations to summon dark entities, and most disturbingly, a chapter dedicated to the creation of soul portraits. These paintings were described as portals, gateways to the spirit world, capable of trapping the essence of a person within their confines. The method was brutal. The subject had to be murdered, their soul forcibly bound to the canvas through a ritual so dark that the book itself refused to describe it in detail. As the protagonist read the chapter, a sickening realization began to take hold. The portrait in his possession was no ordinary painting. It was one of Arnaud's soul portraits. The shadowy figure within the painting wasn't just a depiction. It was a trapped soul, bound to the canvas through a malevolent ritual. And now, that soul was reaching out, trying to break free, using the protagonist as a conduit to escape its eternal prison. The book warned of the dangers of tampering with such paintings. It described how the soul within would grow more powerful over time, feeding on the fear and despair of its owner until it could manifest in the physical world. Once free, the soul would exact its vengeance on the living, seeking to reclaim the life that had been stolen from it. But there was more. Hidden within the text was a cryptic passage, a clue that hinted at the identity of the soul trapped in the portrait. The passage spoke of a woman named Isabella, a beautiful young artist who had been Lucien Arnaud's lover and muse. She had been murdered in cold blood, her soul bound to the painting that now hung in the protagonist's living room. The whispers that had haunted him, the tapping, the moving shadows. It was all Isabella, trying to communicate, trying to break free from the hellish existence that Arnaud had condemned her to. The protagonist's horror deepened as he pieced together the truth. Isabella had been innocent, a victim of Arnaud's madness and obsession with the occult. Her spirit, now corrupted by years of torment, had become something dark, something twisted. She no longer sought justice, she sought revenge. And the protagonist, by bringing the portrait into his home, had unwittingly become her target. The full extent of the curse became clear. The book detailed how the owner of a soul portrait was doomed to suffer the same fate as the trapped soul. Isabella's spirit, driven by hatred and despair, would stop at nothing to take over the protagonist's body, to reclaim her life at the cost of his. The tapping on the glass, the whispers in the dark, they were all signs of her growing power, her increasing ability to influence the world outside the painting. The protagonist was trapped. Destroying the portrait was not an option. The book made it clear that any attempt to destroy a soul portrait would only release the soul within, allowing it to roam free, unbound by the canvas. He considered trying to reverse the ritual, to free Isabella's soul and lay her to rest. But the process was too dangerous, too fraught with risk. The book described how such attempts often ended in death, or worse, in the owner becoming trapped within the painting themselves, their soul taking the place of the one they tried to release. As the days passed, Isabella's presence grew stronger. The whispers became voices, clear and articulate, calling his name in the dead of night, taunting him, begging him to release her. The shadows took on more defined forms, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to dance at the edges of his vision. The figure in the portrait was no longer just a shadowy silhouette. It was Isabella, her features now fully visible, her eyes burning with a hatred that transcended death. One night, the protagonist awoke to find his reflection in the mirror smiling back at him, a smile that he was not making. The face in the mirror was his, but it was twisted, malicious, the eyes dark and lifeless, as if Isabella were trying to push him out, to take his place. The reflection mouthed the words, "Help me," but the voice that came out was not his own. It was hers, pleading, desperate, but with an undercurrent of malevolence that sent chills down his spine. In a final, desperate attempt to rid himself of the curse, the protagonist decided to confront Isabella's spirit directly. He lit candles around the portrait, chanting the words from the book in a ritual meant to communicate with the soul trapped within. The air grew thick with the smell of burning wax and something far more putrid, like rotting flesh. The shadows gathered around the portrait, darkening the room until the only light came from the eyes of the figure within the painting. Isabella's eyes, now filled with a mix of sorrow and fury. The room trembled as the ritual took hold, the walls seeming to close in around him. The whispers became screams and the tapping on the glass turned into a frantic pounding, as if Isabella were trying to claw her way out. The protagonist demanded to know what she wanted, his voice trembling with fear, but Isabella's response was not spoken. It was felt, a wave of cold, seething rage that flooded the room, nearly knocking him to his knees. And then, in a voice that was both beautiful and terrifying, Isabella spoke, her words dripping with venom and despair. "You took my life. Now, I will take yours." The revelation struck him like a physical blow. There was no reasoning with her, no bargaining. Isabella's soul had been twisted by years of torment, her desire for revenge all-consuming. She didn't just want freedom. She wanted to live again, and she would stop at nothing to take the protagonist's place in the world of the living. As the ritual reached its climax, the figure in the portrait began to emerge, her hand pressing against the glass until it cracked, splintering under the force of her will. The protagonist watched in horror as Isabella's form slowly pushed through the canvas, her body half-formed, flickering between the material and the ethereal. The candles around him snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness, save for the glow of her eyes, now blazing with a hellish light. In that moment, the protagonist realized that he was out of time. The curse had reached its endgame, and Isabella was moments away from breaking free. The horror he had uncovered, the macabre revelations that had driven him to this point, all led to one inescapable conclusion. His life was forfeit, a sacrifice to the madness of Lucien Arnaud and the vengeance of Isabella's tormented soul. As Isabella's form solidified, the protagonist could feel his own life force being drained, his body growing weaker as she grew stronger. The room spun, the darkness closing in, and with his last ounce of strength, he screamed. Whether in terror, defiance, or a plea for mercy, he couldn't be sure. But the only response was Isabelle cold, cruel smile as she stepped fully out of the portrait, her hand reaching for his, ready to pull him into the same dark void where she had suffered for so long. And then, everything went black. In the pitch-black darkness, the protagonist's senses sharpened, every sound amplified to a deafening roar. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale dragging cold, stale air into his lungs. The room, once familiar, now felt alien, a twisted labyrinth of shadows and shifting forms. And, in the center of it all stood Isabella, fully emerged from the cursed portrait, her presence dominating the space with an oppressive, otherworldly energy. For a moment, there was silence, an eerie, suffocating stillness that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Then, slowly, a soft, malevolent whisper began to rise from the darkness, weaving through the air like a serpent. "You should never have brought me here." Isabella's voice echoed, dripping with venom and satisfaction. "Now, you'll take my place." The protagonist's heart pounded in his chest, the sound reverberating in his ears like a drumbeat of impending doom. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, paralyzed by a terror so profound it threatened to consume him. All he could do was watch as Isabella took a step forward, her form flickering in the dim light, half solid, half shadow. Her eyes, once merely painted on canvas, now blazed with an infernal light, locking onto his with a gaze that seemed to pierce his very soul. With each step she took, the air grew colder, the shadows lengthening and twisting as if responding to her presence. The room itself seemed to warp, the walls closing in, trapping the protagonist in a claustrophobic nightmare. He could feel the malevolent energy radiating from Isabella, a dark force that pressed down on him, squeezing the breath from his lungs, making it almost impossible to think. Desperately, the protagonist tried to speak, to plead for his life, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his voice strangled by fear. Isabella's smile widened, a cruel, mocking expression that sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over him. "There is no escape," she hissed, her voice now a chorus of overlapping tones, as if 1,000 damned souls were speaking through her. "Your life is mine." And then she was upon him. Isabella moved with an unnatural speed, her figure blurring as she crossed the room in an instant. Her hand shot out, cold as death, and latched onto his wrist with a grip that felt like iron shackles. The protagonist cried out in pain as icy tendrils of energy snaked up his arm, sapping his strength, draining the warmth from his body. He struggled, but it was futile. Isabella's grip tightened, pulling him closer, her eyes burning with a twisted glee. "Feel it," she whispered, her breath icy against his skin. "Feel the life drain from you, just as it was drained from me." The protagonist's vision blurred, his surroundings dissolving into a haze of darkness and flickering lights. He could feel his life force ebbing away, his heartbeat slowing as Isabella's energy coursed through him, taking everything that was his. The pain was unbearable, a searing cold that cut through his veins like shards of ice. He could sense his very essence being pulled from his body, as if his soul were being ripped away piece by agonizing piece. But as the darkness threatened to claim him, a surge of primal fear and defiance flared within the protagonist. He wasn't ready to die. Not like this, not at the hands of a malevolent spirit seeking revenge. Summoning every ounce of willpower he had left, he forced his hand to move, inch by inch, until it reached the object he had stashed in his pocket earlier that evening, a small silver cross he had found while researching ways to protect himself from spirits. With the strength of desperation, the protagonist thrust the cross forward, pressing it against Isabella's cold, dead flesh. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Isabella's eyes widened in shock, and a scream of pure, unadulterated rage tore from her throat, echoing through the room like the wail of a banshee. The effect was immediate. The cross began to glow with a fierce, white light, the warmth of it spreading through the protagonist's hand and up his arm, driving back the cold, dark energy that had been consuming him. Isabella recoiled, her grip loosening as smoke rose from where the cross touched her skin. Her form flickered wildly, shifting between solid and shadow, her face contorting in a mask of fury and pain. You dare?" she shrieked, her voice a cacophony of rage and disbelief. The shadows around her writhed in agony, the malevolent energy that had filled the room now recoiling as if in fear of the light. The protagonist pushed forward, forcing Isabella back, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. He could feel the power of the cross driving the spirit away, weakening her hold on this world. But Isabella was not defeated yet. With a final desperate burst of strength, she lunged forward, her hands reaching for the protagonist's throat, her eyes burning with a hatred that defied death. "You will not escape me," she screamed, her voice shattering the air like glass. "I will take what is mine." The protagonist stumbled backward, his strength waning as the spirit's fury battered against him. But he held the cross firm, pressing it against Isabella's forehead. The light from the cross flared brighter, a blinding white that filled the room, searing away the darkness, the shadows, and the spirit that had haunted him. Isabella let out one final, ear-piercing scream, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of reality. Her form convulsed, the dark energy that had once made her so powerful now dissipating into the air like smoke. Her eyes, once blazing with malevolence, dimmed, her grip slackening as the last of her strength faded. And then, with a final, shuddering gasp, Isabella's form dissolved into nothingness, leaving the room eerily quiet and still. The shadows retreated, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight that had filled the apartment lifted, as if a dark cloud had finally passed. The protagonist collapsed to the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The cross fell from his hand, clattering against the wooden floorboards, its light dimming as the danger passed. For a long moment he lay there, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. As the adrenaline slowly ebbed away, he had survived. Somehow, against all odds, he had managed to banish the spirit of Isabella, to break the curse that had threatened to consume him. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what he had unleashed, of the horrors he had faced. The memory of Isabella's eyes, burning with a hatred that defied death, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Slowly, shakily, the protagonist rose to his feet. The apartment, now quiet and still, felt alien to him, a place of horror that he could no longer call home. The portrait, once the source of so much terror, now hung lifeless on the wall, the figure within no more than a dark smudge on the canvas. The curse had been broken, but at what cost? As he stood there, staring at the now empty painting, the protagonist knew that he could never forget what had happened. The terror, the fear, the sense of being hunted by something beyond comprehension, it would stay with him, a dark shadow in the back of his mind, forever reminding him of the night he had come face to face with the supernatural. And as he turned to leave the room, to escape the nightmare that had nearly claimed his life, a soft whisper echoed in his ear, so faint he almost didn't hear it. "Until we meet again." The protagonist froze, his blood running cold. But when he turned around, there was nothing there, just the empty room, the lifeless portrait, and the silence of a nightmare that was far from over. Even though the cursed portrait now hung lifeless on the wall, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, irreparably wrong. The atmosphere in his apartment remained heavy, oppressive, as though the very walls still remembered the horror they had witnessed. The victory over Isabella's vengeful spirit had been hard won, but it hadn't brought the relief he had desperately hoped for. Instead, it left him with a gnawing unease. a fear that the nightmare was far from over. In the days that followed, the protagonist tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. He avoided the living room where the portrait still hung, now just a dark smear on a cracked canvas, devoid of the sinister energy that had once radiated from it. But even in other rooms, the sense of being watched lingered. It was as though the shadows still harbored remnants of Isabella's presence, silent witnesses to her tormented existence. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the window, seemed to carry a hint of her voice, a reminder that she was never truly gone. Sleep became elusive, haunted by vivid nightmares that blurred the line between dream and reality. In these dreams, the protagonist would find himself back in the living room, staring at the portrait. But this time, the dark smear would start to move, shifting and twisting until Isabella's figure reformed, her eyes blazing with the same malevolent light as before. No matter how many times he tried to wake up, the dream would continue, trapping him in a cycle of terror until he finally jolted awake, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. But the dreams weren't the worst of it. Strange things began happening around the apartment. Small, unsettling occurrences that defied explanation. The protagonist would find objects out of place, doors he was certain he had closed standing ajar, and lights flickering even though the bulbs had been recently replaced. Once he found the cross he had used to banish Isabella lying on the floor in the living room, even though he had left it on his bedside table. The sight of it sent a chill down his spine, a cold reminder that the battle might not be as finished as he had thought. His paranoia grew. The protagonist started feeling as though he was never truly alone, as though something unseen was always just behind him, just out of sight. He would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that darted across the room, a figure standing in a doorway for a split second before vanishing. The oppressive silence in the apartment, once a refuge from the horror, now felt like a ticking clock, counting down to some inevitable, dreadful event. Determined to rid himself of the cursed object once and for all, the protagonist decided to dispose of the portrait. He couldn't simply destroy it. He knew that much from his research. Destroying a soul portrait would only release the spirit within, setting it free to wreak havoc in the physical world. Instead, he decided to bury it, to lock it away somewhere it could never be found. He packed the portrait into a wooden crate, nailed it shut, and drove out to a remote area late one night, far from anyone who might accidentally stumble upon it. Under the cover of darkness, the protagonist dug a deep hole in the cold earth, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of his shovel striking the ground. As he lowered the crate into the grave, a sense of finality settled over him, but it was tainted with unease. He filled the hole quickly, covering the crate with dirt, hoping that this act would finally sever the connection between him and the cursed portrait. But as he turned to leave, the whispering started again, soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the leaves. "You can't bury the past," the voice murmured, so close to his ear that he spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind him. But there was no one, only the still, dark night and the freshly turned earth beneath his feet. Rattled, the protagonist hurried back to his car, glancing over his shoulder the entire way. The drive home was tense, every shadow on the road a potential harbinger of the supernatural, every sound an echo of the nightmare he thought he had escaped. When he finally reached his apartment, the silence was overwhelming, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He collapsed into bed, exhausted, but sleep eluded him, the whispering still echoing in his mind. Days passed, and the protagonist tried to convince himself that it was over, that he had done everything he could to rid himself of the curse. But the signs persisted, the strange noises, the flickering lights, the shadows that moved on their own. They all continued, driving him to the edge of sanity. It was as if the portrait, buried deep in the earth, was still somehow connected to him, its dark influence reaching out from the grave. Then came the night when everything changed. The protagonist awoke in the dead of night, his heart racing, the air thick with the scent of decay. He sat up in bed, every sense on high alert. his mind screaming that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. But there was something else, a sound, soft and insistent, coming from the living room. It was the unmistakable sound of tapping, just like before. Terror gripped him as he realized what was happening. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, until it was a deafening rhythm that reverberated through the walls. He tried to move, to get out of bed, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pinning him down, holding him in place as the noise reached a fever pitch. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. Silence descended, so complete and absolute that it seemed to swallow all sound. The protagonist strained to hear, every nerve in his body on edge, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. Clear, cold, and unmistakable. "You thought you could escape me?" The protagonist's blood ran cold. The voice was Isabella's, filled with a cruel amusement that sent shivers down his spine. He could feel her presence, so close, as though she were standing right beside him, her breath icy against his skin. But when he turned his head, there was nothing, only the empty darkness of his room. The voice continued, taunting, whispering in his ear. "You can bury the portrait, but you can't bury me. I'll always find you." Panic surged through him. He tried to scream, to call out, but no sound escaped his lips. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in, suffocating him. The walls of his apartment warping and twisting as if the very structure of reality was bending to Isabella's will. The tapping resumed, louder than before, now coming from all around him. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was everywhere, echoing in a maddening chorus that drowned out all rational thought. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow moving in the darkness, slowly taking shape. It was Isabella, her form emerging from the shadows, just as she had from the portrait. Her face was pale, her eyes burning with that same malevolent light, her smile twisted in a grotesque parody of human expression. She was no longer confined to the canvas. She was free, and she had come for him. The protagonist's body finally responded, adrenaline surging through him as he scrambled out of bed. But there was nowhere to run. Isabella's figure loomed closer, her shadow stretching across the room, swallowing everything in its path. Her voice filled the air, a dark symphony of whispers and screams that clawed at his mind, pulling him deeper into the abyss. "You can't escape," she hissed, her voice surrounding him, invading his thoughts. "We're bound together now. Forever." He stumbled into the living room, desperate for a way out. But the room was a distorted nightmare. The furniture twisted into impossible shapes, the walls closing in. The portrait, now restored to its original state, hung on the wall, but it was no longer empty. Isabella's figure stood within it, fully formed, her eyes locked onto his with a gaze that promised eternal torment. With nowhere left to turn, the protagonist fell to his knees, the weight of despair crushing him. The room spun around him, the shadows swirling in a macabre dance as Isabella's laughter filled the air, echoing off the walls. He could feel her presence growing stronger, her hold on him tightening with every passing second. And then, just as the darkness was about to consume him completely, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, a void that swallowed all sound and light. The protagonist knelt there, trembling, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. He could feel Isabella's gaze on him, cold and unrelenting. But when he looked up, she was gone. The portrait was empty once more, the figure within it nothing more than a shadowy smear on the canvas. But the terror didn't fade. The protagonist knew, deep in his soul, that Isabella was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her next opportunity to strike. The curse had not been lifted. It had merely changed. Isabella was free, and she would never stop until she had claimed him, body and soul.